In suburban Florida, a 68-year-old retired teacher was about to face her cruelest lesson. What started as a birthday celebration took a shocking turn when she encountered systematic psychological warfare. Eleanor Martinez wasn't your typical grandmother. For 40 years, she had dedicated her life to education, known for her sharp mind and unwavering principles. When her daughter-in-law delivered calculated insults disguised as concern, claiming Eleanor would forget everything anyway, she had no idea she was challenging someone who remembered every slight. Eleanor's decision to document the abuse would lead to an unprecedented legal battle. What began as silent endurance would become a fight for elder dignity that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Martinez stood in her kitchen, surveying the modest spread she'd prepared for her 68th birthday celebration. The yellow cake, made from scratch, just as she'd done for every family birthday for the past 40 years, sat proudly on her grandmother's crystal cake stand. 40 years of teaching had taught her that presentation mattered, that small rituals held families together when larger forces threatened to pull them apart. She smoothed her emerald green blouse, the one Sophia had given her last Christmas, and checked her reflection in the window above the sink. The Florida humidity had already begun its assault on her carefully styled silver hair, but she looked presentable, dignified even. At least she hoped so. The doorbell's cheerful chime announced the first arrivals. Eleanor's heart lifted as she heard Sophia's voice in the hallway, followed by the thundering footsteps of her grandchildren. 8-year-old Marcus burst through the kitchen doorway first, his school backpack still slung over one shoulder. "Abuela, happy birthday!" He wrapped his arms around her waist with the fierce enthusiasm only children possessed. "Thank you, Mijo," Eleanor said, returning the embrace and breathing in the scent of playground dirt and childhood innocence that clung to him. Behind Marcus, 10-year-old Isabella approached with more restraint, offering a careful hug and a handmade card decorated with glitter hearts. Sophia followed, her paralegal's briefcase traded for a small wrapped package, and the tired smile of a single mother juggling too many responsibilities. "Sorry we're running late, Mama." Isabella's soccer practice ran over. "You're here now, that's what matters." Eleanor accepted her daughter's kiss on the cheek, noting the tension lines around Sophia's eyes that seemed deeper each visit. Since her divorce 3 years ago, Sophia had thrown herself into work and her children with an intensity that worried Eleanor. But tonight wasn't about worries. Daniel arrived next, carrying a bottle of wine and the easy smile that had charmed teachers and smoothed over playground disputes since childhood. At 29, he still possessed an optimism about family dynamics that Eleanor both envied and feared would be crushed by reality. "Happy birthday, Mom." His hug was warm, genuine, accompanied by the faint scent of the expensive cologne he splurged on despite his graphic designer's modest income. "This is from that little vineyard in Napa you mentioned wanting to try." Eleanor examined the bottle's elegant label. "You remembered?" "Of course I remembered. Though I'm still not convinced you actually need wine to deal with us." The joke fell flat as car doors slammed in the driveway, announcing Michael and Jessica's arrival. Eleanor's stomach tightened, an involuntary response she'd developed over the past 2 years, ever since Jessica had become a permanent fixture at family gatherings. Michael entered first, his architect's precise movements somehow more constrained than usual. His embrace felt dutiful, distracted. "Happy birthday, Mom. You look wonderful." "Thank you, sweetheart." Eleanor studied her middle child's face, searching for signs of the boy who used to spend hours in this very kitchen, helping her bake cookies and sharing his dreams of designing beautiful buildings. That boy still existed somewhere beneath the careful politeness, she was certain. Jessica swept in behind him, her marketing executive's smile bright and practiced. She looked flawless, as always, her dark hair falling in perfect waves, her designer dress hitting exactly the right note between festive and sophisticated. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, closing deals, getting her way. "Eleanor," Jessica's voice carried just the right amount of warmth. Happy birthday, 68. Can you believe it? Where does the time go? The question hung in the air, with subtle barbs Eleanor was only beginning to recognize. Where indeed? Into the void of an aging mind, perhaps? Into the irrelevance of advancing years? Thank you, Jessica. Eleanor accepted the brief, perfunctory hug that smelled of expensive perfume and felt like a business transaction. I hope you don't mind, but I brought a salad, Jessica continued, producing a store-bought container from her oversized handbag. I know how challenging meal preparation can become at this stage of life. I wanted to make sure there were some healthy options. Sophia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Michael began examining his phone with sudden intensity. That's very thoughtful, Eleanor replied, though she'd spent the morning preparing enough food to feed twice this number of people. Her menu planning skills, honed by decades of hosting family gatherings, apparently no longer impressed her daughter-in-law. As they moved to the living room, Jessica's commentary continued in the guise of helpfulness. Oh, Eleanor, you might want to be careful with those throw rugs. I read an article about fall risks for seniors. Maybe we should look into some of those non-slip mats. I know a great medical supply store. Eleanor had navigated these same rugs safely for 15 years, but she found herself glancing down, suddenly conscious of every step. The conversation during dinner followed familiar patterns. Jessica dominated with stories from her marketing firm, weaving in casual observations about Eleanor's house, her habits, her apparent limitations. Each comment was delivered with a smile, often followed by a laugh that invited others to join in the gentle mocking of age-related quirks. Eleanor, you're so lucky to have lived through so much history, Jessica said while cutting her store-bought salad into precise portions. Sometimes I wonder if you remember what it was like before we had cell phones and GPS. I imagine it must be hard to keep track of all the changes. I remember quite clearly, actually, Eleanor said quietly. I have lived through the moon landing, the civil rights movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall. My memory serves me well. Of course, Jessica's smile never wavered. Though you have to admit, it's different now, keeping up with technology at your age. Michael was telling me about your struggles with the new TV remote. Eleanor's face flushed. The conversation about the remote had been a private moment between mother and son, a small frustration about too many buttons and unclear labels. She hadn't realized it would become ammunition for public embarrassment. Michael's face colored. I didn't mean… Oh, it's nothing to be ashamed of, Jessica continued smoothly. We all have our limitations. The important thing is recognizing them before they become dangerous. Speaking of which, have you been remembering to take your medications? I worry about seniors living alone and managing complex medication schedules. The room fell silent except for the gentle clink of silverware against plates. Eleanor felt every eye on her, gauging her response, measuring her competence. Carmen Santos chose that moment to ring the doorbell, her timing impeccable as always. Eleanor had never been more grateful for her neighbor's arrival. Carmen entered with the brisk energy of a retired nurse, who'd spent 40 years managing chaos and taking no nonsense from anyone. Just not the ones she'd expected. Attorney David Chen's office occupied the corner of a modest professional building in downtown Orlando, its windows offering a view of the courthouse where Eleanor's future would soon be decided. She sat across from his mahogany desk, her notebook open like a battle plan, while Chen reviewed her meticulous documentation with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. Mrs. Martinez, he said, looking up from the pages that chronicled 2 years of systematic abuse. In 30 years of practicing elder law, I've rarely seen such thorough documentation. Your teaching background shows. The coincidence of his surname had created an awkward moment when they'd first met, Chen studying her face for signs of confusion or prejudice, Eleanor explaining with dry humor that she was fighting one Chen, not all of them. But his credentials spoke for themselves. Harvard Law, 15 years specializing in elder abuse cases, a personal mission born from losing his own mother to institutional neglect. The intentional infliction of emotional distress claim is solid, Chen continued, his pen marking key passages in Eleanor's journal. Systematic, witnessed, recorded. The defamation angle is even stronger. Her social media posts create a public record of false statements about your mental competence. Eleanor felt vindication wash over her like warm sunlight. After months of questioning her own perceptions, professional validation felt revolutionary. "What happens next?" she asked. "We file the complaint this afternoon. Once it's public record, there's no going back." Across town, Jessica Chen Martinez was implementing her own strategy. She'd hired Patricia Vasquez, a high-powered attorney specializing in defending against harassment claims, someone who understood that the best defense was often a strategic offense. Within hours of Chen filing Eleanor's lawsuit, Jessica launched her counter-campaign. Her Instagram story featured a carefully curated collection of photos. Eleanor looking confused at a family dinner, a screenshot of a missed family group text, images that painted a picture of cognitive decline and family concern. The caption read, "Sometimes loving an elderly family member means making difficult decisions for their safety. My heart breaks for families dealing with these challenges. #eldercare, #familylove, #hard choices." By evening, the local news had picked up the story. Channel 9's tagline read, "Grandmother sues daughter-in-law for hurt feelings." Eleanor watched the coverage from her living room, Sophia beside her providing legal commentary and moral support. The reporter presented it as human interest, quirky family drama rather than a serious case about elder dignity. "They're making it sound frivolous," Sophia said, her paralegal instincts bristling at the mischaracterization. "Let them," Eleanor replied calmly. "Chen warned me this would happen." Jessica's counting on public perception that elderly people are overly sensitive, that lawsuits are frivolous when they involve hurt feelings rather than broken bones. Her phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, others critical. Carmen had organized a neighborhood support group, while Jessica's college friends flooded social media with posts about ungrateful elderly relatives and vindictive in-laws. The battle lines were drawn. Eleanor Martinez, retired teacher, versus Jessica Chen Martinez, marketing executive. Experience versus youth. Dignity versus manipulation. The war for Eleanor's reputation and her right to live free from abuse had officially begun. The story broke wide on a Tuesday morning when Channel 9's investigative reporter, Maria Santos, decided there was more to the than met the eye. Eleanor first learned about it when Carmen called at 7:30, her voice tight with concern. "Turn on the news, dear. They're talking about your case, and it's not what we expected." Eleanor fumbled for her remote, her morning coffee growing cold as she watched her private pain become public entertainment. The segment led with a split screen, her driver's license photo next to Jessica's perfectly composed professional headshot from her marketing firm's website. In what's being called the Florida family feud, the anchor announced with barely concealed amusement, 68-year-old Eleanor Martinez is suing her 32-year-old daughter-in-law for emotional distress, claiming systematic verbal abuse over concerns about her mental capacity. The reporter's tone made it clear which side of the story they found more credible. Jessica appeared on camera outside her sleek downtown office, perfectly styled and composed, speaking with the measured concern of someone discussing a beloved but troubled relative. "This is heartbreaking for our entire family," Jessica said, her voice carrying just the right note of sorrowful dignity. "Eleanor is struggling with some very real challenges that come with aging. We've all been trying to support her through this difficult transition, but sometimes love looks like tough conversations about safety and care options." The camera caught her dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a gesture so perfectly timed that Eleanor wondered if Jessica had practiced it. "We're praying for healing and hoping Eleanor gets the help she needs," Jessica continued. "This lawsuit is just another example of the confusion and paranoia that families dealing with cognitive decline often face." Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Within minutes, her voicemail was full. Some calls offered support from neighbors and former students who remembered her sharp mind and fierce advocacy. But others were cruel. Strangers who'd seen the news and felt compelled to share their opinions about greedy old people and frivolous lawsuits. One particularly vicious caller suggested she belonged in a nursing home where she couldn't bother decent families with her delusions. Sophia arrived within the hour, her paralegal's briefcase supplemented by a box of tissues and a thermos of Cuban coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I've been monitoring social media since 5 this morning, Sophia said, setting up her laptop on Eleanor's kitchen table. It's not good, Mom. Jessica's narrative is gaining traction. The hashtag Florida Family Feud was trending locally, with hundreds of posts weighing in on the case. Many supported Jessica's portrayal of herself as a long-suffering daughter-in-law, dealing with an unreasonable elder. Comments ranged from sympathetic to savage. My grandmother went through the same thing. They get paranoid and difficult. This poor woman is just trying to help. Sue-happy seniors are destroying American families. This is disgusting. Maybe if Eleanor spent less time in court and more time in therapy, her family could heal. But there were other voices too. Eleanor's former students who remembered her as brilliant and kind, neighbors who'd witnessed Jessica's behavior firsthand, and elderly people who recognized their own experiences in Eleanor's story. Carmen appeared at the kitchen door without knocking, carrying a manila folder thick with papers. I've been busy, she announced, settling into her usual chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent 40 years solving problems through methodical action. Witness statements from 6 neighbors who've observed Jessica's treatment of you over the past 2 years. Mrs. Rodriguez next door heard her call you a burden during last year's Christmas party. The Petersons saw her roll her eyes and make that crazy gesture when you were talking at the block party. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's investigative skills, but also embarrassment that her humiliation had been so visible to the neighborhood. There's more, Carmen continued, her nurse's efficiency evident in how she organized the papers. I contacted 3 families from our community center whose elderly members have dealt with similar situations. They're willing to testify about the pattern of abuse disguised as concern. Sophia looked up from her laptop, her expression grim. We're going to need all the help we can get. Jessica's people are working overtime. They've created a GoFundMe for her legal expenses with the tagline, Help a Young Woman Fight False Accusations. It's raised $8,000 since yesterday. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Jessica, with her marketing executive salary and expensive wardrobe, positioning herself as the victim in need of financial support. Eleanor's phone rang. David Chen's name appeared on the screen. Mrs. Martinez, I'm calling about the discovery process. We've uncovered some interesting material from Jessica's social media history that predates your lawsuit by months. Eleanor put the call on speaker so Sophia and Carmen could hear. Jessica's been documenting what she calls your decline for over a year, Chen continued. Posts about patients with elderly relatives, articles about memory care facilities, comments on friends' posts about dealing with difficult in-laws. She's been building a public narrative of your incompetence long before the anniversary dinner incident. Sophia leaned forward, her paralegal training engaging. That shows premeditation. This wasn't spontaneous concern. It was calculated character assassination. Exactly. And there's more. Her private messages to friends are even more damaging. She refers to you as the old bat, discusses strategies for managing the Eleanor situation, and jokes about putting you out to pasture in assisted living. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of Jessica's cruelty, but now it was tempered by the satisfaction of evidence. Each cruel comment was another nail in Jessica's carefully constructed coffin of false concern. The most damaging evidence came from her work computer, Chen continued. She used company time and resources to research elder care facilities, pricing out options for your placement. Her browser history shows dozens of searches for dealing with difficult in-laws and, quote, signs of dementia in elderly relatives. Carmen's sharp intake of breath was audible. She was building a case against you. Not just building, implementing, Chen replied. This was systematic, deliberate, and documented. Jessica may be good at public relations, but she's terrible at covering her digital tracks. As Eleanor hung up, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The court of public opinion might be swayed by Jessica's polished performance, but the court of law would examine evidence, not emotional manipulation. The doorbell rang and Sophia went to answer it, returning with a stack of letters from the mailman. Fan mail, she said with a wry smile. The good and the bad. Eleanor opened the first letter, from a woman in Jacksonville whose mother had endured similar treatment from a daughter-in-law. The second was from a former student who'd seen the news and wanted to testify about Eleanor's mental acuity. The third was from an elderly man whose own family had dismissed his concerns about mistreatment until he took legal action. But the fourth letter made Eleanor's hands tremble. It was from Michael, postmarked the day before, written in his careful architect's handwriting. Mom, I know you'll probably never forgive me for not protecting you sooner. Jessica and I are separated. I'm staying at Daniel's while I figure out what kind of man I want to be. I should have stood up for you years ago. I should have seen what everyone else saw. I'm sorry I failed you when you needed me most. I love you and I support your decision to fight back. It's about time someone held Jessica accountable for her cruelty. Eleanor read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. The public battle for her reputation was far from over, but she'd already won something more important: the return of her son's respect and the validation that her fight was righteous. Jessica might control the narrative in the media, but Eleanor controlled the truth, and in the end, that would be enough. The deposition room in David Chen's law office felt sterile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Its beige walls witnessed countless moments when truth finally emerged from shadows. Eleanor sat beside her attorney, her notebook closed for once, watching as Jessica's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under the methodical questioning of legal discovery. Jessica sat across the polished conference table, flanked by her attorney Patricia Vasquez and a court reporter whose fingers moved like a pianist's across her stenography machine. For the first time since Eleanor had known her, Jessica looked genuinely uncomfortable, her marketing executive's polish dimmed by the unforgiving light of sworn testimony. 2 years of systematic erosion disguised as family concern. Mrs. Martinez, Chen said gently, are you all right? Eleanor looked up at her attorney, this other Chen who'd become her champion instead of her tormentor, and managed a small smile. I'm angry, she said honestly. But I'm also relieved. For months I wondered if I was losing my mind, if I was actually becoming the burden she painted me as. Now I know the problem was never my perception. It was her intention. Sophia arrived to drive Eleanor home, her paralegal's training evident in how she immediately began discussing the implications of Jessica's testimony. She's finished, Mom, Sophia said as they drove through the familiar streets of Eleanor's neighborhood. Her own words prove premeditation, malice, and systematic abuse. No jury will side with her after hearing those text messages. But Eleanor's mind was on Michael, wondering if he'd known about Jessica's communications, wondering how much of her isolation had been orchestrated by someone he trusted and loved. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Orlando Police Department. No relation to your attorney or defendant. I've been following your case in the news and wanted you to know that we've received reports from 3 other elderly individuals about similar treatment from family members. Your courage in speaking out has inspired others to come forward. Would you be willing to speak with them? Eleanor stared at the message, understanding for the first time that her fight had become larger than personal vindication. She'd become an inadvertent advocate for elderly people who'd been suffering in silence, accepting abuse disguised as concern because they'd been taught that family harmony mattered more than personal dignity. Sophia, she said quietly, I want to meet with those other victims. I want them to know they're not alone. As they pulled into Eleanor's driveway, she saw Carmen waiting on her front porch with a plate of homemade cookies and a smile that said she'd been following the day's developments with the keen interest of someone who'd spent 40 years fighting for patient dignity. How'd it go? Carmen asked. Eleanor climbed the steps to her home, her sanctuary, her proof that she was capable of independent living despite Jessica's campaign to prove otherwise. Justice, she said simply. It went like justice. Inside her house, Eleanor opened her notebook one final time, not to document new abuse, but to write a different kind of entry. Today I learned that keeping records wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Today I learned that my memory wasn't failing. Someone was deliberately trying to make me doubt it. Today I learned that fighting back doesn't destroy families. It protects them from people who would destroy them from within. The revelation phase was complete. Now came the reckoning. The call came at 8 in the morning, 2 days before the trial was set to begin. Eleanor was in her kitchen preparing breakfast when David Chen's voice cut through the quiet routine of her Tuesday morning. Mrs. Martinez, Jessica's attorney wants to discuss a settlement. They're requesting a meeting this afternoon. Eleanor's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. After months of preparation, of depositions and discovery, of watching Jessica's public relations campaign crumble under the weight of documented evidence, the prospect of resolution felt both anticlimactic and loaded with potential pitfalls. "What kind of settlement?" she asked, settling into her kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd first documented Jessica's abuse in her notebook. "A public apology, limited financial compensation, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement." Patricia Vasquez is painting it as a way to, quote, heal the family and move forward without further public spectacle. Eleanor understood the subtext immediately. Jessica wanted to control the narrative one final time, to craft an apology that minimized her actions while silencing Eleanor's ability to discuss what had really happened. "I'll think about it," Eleanor said, though her instincts were already rebelling against the idea of letting Jessica escape meaningful consequences. By noon, her kitchen had become an impromptu war room. Sophia sat at the table with legal documents spread before her, while Carmen occupied her usual chair with a fresh pot of coffee and the determined expression of someone who'd watched her friends suffer too long in silence. Daniel had arrived an hour earlier, his diplomatic optimism warring with newfound understanding of his sister-in-law's true nature. "The financial offer is insulting," Sophia said, tapping her pen against a legal pad filled with calculations. $25,000 for 2 years of systematic psychological abuse? Jessica spends more than that on her car payments. Carmen snorted with derision. That woman made a 6-figure salary while she was tearing Eleanor down. $25,000 is what she'd spend on a vacation. The front door opened without a knock. A privilege only Michael had retained despite everything that had happened. He entered the kitchen looking haggard, his architect's usual precision replaced by the rumpled appearance of someone who'd been sleeping on his brother's couch for 3 weeks. "Mom," he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. "I heard about the settlement offer." Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the weight loss, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he poured himself coffee without being invited. The separation from Jessica had been harder on him than he'd admitted, but something in his posture suggested this visit carried more weight than casual family consultation. "Jessica came to see me last night," Michael continued, finally meeting Eleanor's gaze. "She's desperate. Her job is in jeopardy because of the negative publicity. Her family is pressuring her to end this before it gets worse. She's willing to make concessions." "What kind of concessions?" Sophia's paralegal voice carried a sharp edge of suspicion. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his coffee cup rattling against the saucer as he set it down. "A public apology. A larger financial settlement. And—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly tasted bitter. "She claims she's pregnant." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of Eleanor's mantel clock and Carmen's sharp intake of breath. Eleanor felt the familiar twist in her stomach. Jessica's final manipulation, designed to exploit the family's most fundamental instincts toward protection and forgiveness. "She's lying," Sophia said flatly, her fingers already moving across her phone screen. "She posted photos from a wine tasting event 3 days ago. She was drinking alcohol and bragging about the expensive vintages." Sophia turned her phone toward the table, displaying Jessica's Instagram story, perfectly curated images of expensive wine glasses and enthusiastic tasting notes, posted less than 72 hours earlier. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, a grief so profound that Eleanor felt her maternal instincts override her anger at his enabling behavior. "She's been lying about a lot of things," he said quietly. "I found credit card bills she'd been hiding. Designer purchases, spa treatments, expensive dinners, charged to cards I thought were for emergencies only. $15,000 in debt I didn't know about, all while she was complaining about the cost of your medications and suggesting you couldn't afford to live independently." Eleanor reached across the table to take her son's hand. feeling the tremor of someone whose world had been systematically dismantled by someone he'd trusted completely. "Michael, I'm sorry you're going through this." "No, Mom. I'm the one who should be apologizing. I enabled her for 2 years. I watched her tear you down and I said nothing, because I was afraid of conflict, afraid of admitting I'd married someone capable of cruelty." His voice cracked with the weight of suppressed emotion. "I failed you when you needed protection most." Daniel reached over to squeeze his brother's shoulder, his diplomatic instincts finally aligned with clear moral purpose. "We all failed her, Michael. We all chose family peace over family justice." Eleanor's phone rang, interrupting the moment of painful honesty. David Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Martinez, we have a problem. Jessica's attorney is claiming she's pregnant and requesting a delay in proceedings due to medical complications from stress. They're asking for a 6-month continuance." Eleanor put the call on speaker, watching Sophia's face transform into professional outrage. "That's a stall tactic," Sophia said loudly enough for Chen to hear. "She's trying to buy time to rebuild her public image and hope the story fades from media attention." "My thoughts exactly," Chen replied. "But we need to be prepared for the judge to grant the request if she provides medical documentation." "Mrs. Martinez, can you describe the defendant's behavior during your 68th birthday party?" Eleanor's voice was steady, though her hands remained folded tightly in her lap. "Jessica made several comments about my age and memory, always phrased as concern but designed to embarrass me in front of my family. She questioned whether I'd remembered to take medications, which I don't take, and suggested I was too old to live alone safely." "How did these comments make you feel?" "Humiliated. Diminished. Like a burden instead of the mother who raised 3 successful children and taught high school English for 40 years. Eleanor's voice carried the quiet authority she'd once used to command classrooms. "I began to doubt myself, to question whether I was losing my memory or becoming a danger to myself." That was the point. Chen introduced the video Sophia had taken during the anniversary dinner, the social media posts, the witness statements. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable pattern of calculated cruelty. Carmen's testimony proved devastating in its simplicity. The retired nurse spoke with clinical precision about watching Eleanor's confidence erode, about witnessing Jessica's systematic attacks disguised as humor and concern. "I've worked with elderly patients for 40 years, Carmen said, her voice carrying the weight of professional experience. "I know the difference between someone who's genuinely concerned and someone who's deliberately undermining an older person's confidence." Jessica Chen Martinez was engaged in textbook psychological abuse. When Jessica took the stand, Sterling tried to present her as a misunderstood young woman navigating difficult family relationships. But under Chen's cross-examination, her carefully constructed mask began to crack. "Ms. Chen Martinez, you testified that you were concerned about Mrs. Martinez's memory. Can you give specific examples of memory problems you witnessed?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Well, she seemed confused sometimes, forgetful. Can you provide a specific instance?" There were several times when she seemed to forget conversations we'd had." "What conversations, specifically?" The more Chen pressed, the more Jessica's composure unraveled. Her answers became defensive, then angry. When confronted with her own social media posts complaining about quote, 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 and quote, 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 senior moments, Jessica's true nature emerged. "Look, everyone knows that older people can be difficult," she snapped, her careful veneer finally dissolving. "They get set in their ways, they resist change, they want to maintain control long after they should hand it over to younger, more capable family members." "I was trying to help Eleanor see reality." "Reality according to whom?" Chen asked quietly. "According to anyone with common sense. She's 68 years old, living alone in a big house, insisting on doing everything herself when she should be grateful that younger family members are willing to take care of her." Jessica's voice rose with each word, her mask completely gone. "Old people need guidance whether they want it or not. They lose perspective, they forget things. They become burdens on their families while pretending they're still capable of independent living." The courtroom fell silent. Even Jessica's attorney looked stunned by her client's outburst. On the witness stand, Jessica seemed to realize what she'd revealed, her face flushing with embarrassment and rage. Chen let the silence stretch before asking his final question. Ms. Chen Martinez, do you believe that elderly people like Mrs. Martinez, like many members of this jury, deserve respect and dignity? Jessica's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Any answer would either contradict her previous testimony or reinforce her prejudice against the elderly. Her silence spoke volumes. During closing arguments, Chen's voice carried quiet passion. Members of the jury, you've heard the defendant's true feelings about elderly people. You've seen the evidence of systematic psychological abuse. Mrs. Martinez isn't asking for millions of dollars. She's asking for recognition that what happened to her was wrong, that words have consequences, and that our society's most vulnerable members deserve protection from those who would diminish their dignity for personal convenience. Sterling's closing felt hollow after Jessica's courtroom meltdown. My client spoke in anger and frustration. We all say things we don't mean when pressed. The law requires intent to cause severe emotional distress, not miscommunication between family members. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson, a woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and determined eyes, stood with the gravity of someone who understood the stakes beyond this single case. We find for the plaintiff, Eleanor Martinez, on the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress. We award damages in the amount of $50,000. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, not from the money, which had never been the point, but from the validation. 12 strangers had listened to her story and decided that her dignity mattered, that Jessica's treatment had been unacceptable, that elderly people deserved protection under the law. Jessica shot up from her chair, her face twisted with fury. This is ridiculous. She's a bitter old woman who can't accept that she's not the center of attention anymore. Judge Williams's gavel cracked like thunder. Ms. Chen Martinez, you will control yourself in my courtroom or be held in contempt. But Jessica was beyond control, months of carefully maintained facades cracking like a dam under pressure. She turned my husband against me. She manipulated everyone with her victim act. I was trying to help her face reality. Bailiff, Judge Williams said calmly, please escort Ms. Chen Martinez from my courtroom. As Jessica was led away, still shouting about ungrateful elderly people and manipulative mothers-in-law, Michael sat frozen in his chair. For one moment, his eyes met Eleanor's across the courtroom. She saw recognition there. Finally, belatedly, he understood what his wife truly was. But instead of approaching his mother, instead of offering the apology and reconciliation Eleanor had hoped for, Michael gathered his things and followed Jessica's path out of the courtroom. His choice was made, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Daniel reached Eleanor first, tears streaming down his face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you sooner. I should have stood up for you. Sophia wrapped her arms around both of them, her fierce protectiveness finally vindicated. You did it, Mom. You stood up for yourself. Carmen's embrace smelled of jasmine and triumph. Maja, you showed them all. You showed everyone that we don't have to accept unacceptable treatment. As they left the courthouse together, reporters called out questions about elder abuse and family dynamics. Eleanor paused on the steps, looking back at the building where justice had been served, where her voice had been heard and believed. The victory felt both complete and hollow. Complete because 12 jurors had validated her experience, hollow because it had cost her a son who chose his wife's cruelty over his mother's dignity. But as she walked toward Sophia's car, surrounded by the people who truly loved her, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the solid ground of self-respect beneath her feet. She had refused to accept unacceptable treatment, and the world had listened. The price had been higher than she'd hoped, but some things, dignity, truth, the courage to stand up for what's right, were worth any cost. 6 months after the verdict, Eleanor Martinez stood at the podium in the Sunset Community Center, looking out at an audience of faces that reflected her own journey, elderly men and women who had learned to make themselves small, to accept unacceptable treatment in the name of family peace. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, but Eleanor's voice carried the steady authority she'd honed through decades of teaching. "My name is Eleanor Martinez, and I sued my daughter-in-law for emotional abuse." Eleanor looked around her kitchen table at her family, her children who'd finally found the courage to support her fight, her friend who'd never wavered in her belief in justice. She thought about the other elderly victims who'd contacted her through Detective Chen, people who'd been inspired by her courage to speak out about their own abuse. "Mr. Chen," she said clearly, "I want to proceed to trial. No settlement, no delays, no non-disclosure agreements. Jessica has spent 2 years trying to silence me with shame and self-doubt. I won't let her silence me now with false pregnancy claims and legal manipulations." Carmen's smile was fierce with approval. Sophia nodded with professional satisfaction. Daniel's face showed relief that the family's long pattern of conflict avoidance was finally broken. Michael looked up from his coffee cup, meeting his mother's eyes directly for the first time since entering the kitchen. "I'll testify for you, Mom," he said quietly. "About the financial deception. About the things she said about you when she thought no one would ever find out. I'll tell the truth, even if it destroys what's left of my marriage." Eleanor squeezed her son's hand, understanding that his offer represented more than testimony. It was his choice to finally protect her instead of his wife's feelings. "Thank you, sweetheart. But I need you to testify because it's right, not because you feel guilty about the past." As her family gathered around her kitchen table, Eleanor felt the same sense of purpose she'd experienced in her classroom when a difficult lesson finally clicked for her students. Some truths were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. Jessica could claim pregnancy, delay tactics, and public sympathy. But Eleanor had something more powerful: the truth, documented and witnessed, supported by people who'd finally found the courage to speak it aloud. The trial would proceed. Justice would have its day. And Eleanor Martinez would remind the world that elderly voices mattered, even when, especially when, others tried to silence them. The courthouse steps gleamed in the morning sun as Eleanor Martinez adjusted her navy blue dress, the same one she'd worn to countless award ceremonies during her teaching career. Attorney David Chen walked beside her, his briefcase containing months of carefully documented evidence, his expression calm but alert. Behind them, Sophia gripped her purse tightly, while Daniel's nervous energy crackled like static electricity. "Remember," Chen murmured as they approached the courthouse doors, "tell the truth simply and clearly. Let the evidence speak for itself." Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. After all these months of preparation, depositions, and sleepless nights, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Through the glass doors, she could see Jessica seated at the defendant's table, her expensive attorney, whispering urgently in her ear while she maintained the composed mask Eleanor had learned to recognize as her war face. The courtroom filled gradually. Curious neighbors, a few reporters drawn by the unusual nature of the case, and Carmen Santos settling into the front row like a protective guardian angel. Michael sat on the opposite side, his posture rigid with conflict, avoiding eye contact with his mother as Jessica's hand rested possessively on his arm. Judge Patricia Williams entered with the no-nonsense authority Eleanor remembered from her most effective principles. At 65 herself, the judge's gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes sharp with intelligence and decades of courtroom experience. "Your Honor," Chen began his opening statement, "this case is about dignity. About the systematic psychological abuse of an elderly woman by someone who should have shown her respect and love. Mrs. Martinez isn't seeking revenge. She's seeking recognition that words have power, that cruelty disguised as concern is still cruelty, and that our elders deserve protection under the law." Jessica's attorney, a polished man in his 50s named Robert Sterling, painted a different picture. "Your Honor, family dynamics are complicated. My client is a young woman who married into a family with established patterns and expectations. Any perceived slights or misunderstandings are the result of generational differences and miscommunication, not intentional cruelty. When Eleanor took the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Chen's questions were gentle but thorough, walking her through the timeline of abuse with methodical precision. The words still felt strange on her tongue, but they no longer carried shame. "I'm here tonight because I learned something important during that legal battle. Our dignity is not negotiable, regardless of our age." In the front row, Carmen Santos beamed with pride while taking notes for the community newsletter. Beside her, Sophia managed the registration table, where a steady stream of seniors had signed up for Eleanor's monthly Dignity and Rights workshops. The response had overwhelmed them both. Apparently, Eleanor's story had touched a nerve that ran deep through their suburban Florida community. "I spent 2 years believing I was too sensitive, too demanding, too unwilling to keep peace." Eleanor's hands rested calmly on the podium, no longer trembling with uncertainty. "I convinced myself that accepting disrespectful treatment was the mature thing to do, the loving thing to do. I was wrong." An elderly man in the third row nodded emphatically. Eleanor had met Harold the previous month when he'd approached her after a smaller gathering, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he described his son's wife who mocked his hearing loss and made jokes about his old man smell at family dinners. Tonight, Harold sat straighter, his eyes focused with new purpose. The community center had become Eleanor's unexpected second career. What started as a single speaking engagement had evolved into monthly workshops, support groups, and advocacy meetings. Local newspapers had picked up her story, leading to invitations from senior centers across the state. The money from the lawsuit verdict, $50,000 that felt more like $50 million in validation, had been donated to start the Dignity Initiative, a nonprofit focused on recognizing and addressing elder abuse within families. "The hardest part wasn't the legal battle," Eleanor continued. "The hardest part was accepting that standing up for myself might cost relationships I desperately wanted to preserve. But here's what I learned. A relationship that requires you to accept abuse isn't a relationship worth preserving." Her phone buzzed gently in her pocket, a text from Daniel, who had thrown himself into helping with the initiative after the trial. Tonight he was babysitting Sophia's children so she could attend the workshop. The family dynamics had shifted profoundly since the courtroom victory, but in ways Eleanor was still learning to navigate. Daniel had become her closest ally, his guilt over initially dismissing her concerns transformed into fierce advocacy. He'd redesigned the initiative's website, created social media campaigns, and spoke at men's groups about recognizing elder abuse. His artistic sensitivity, once focused on avoiding conflict, now channeled toward creating beautiful, powerful materials that helped elderly people recognize their worth. Sophia's support had deepened into something like partnership. Her legal expertise proved invaluable in developing resources and referral networks, while her protective instincts had expanded beyond Eleanor to encompass the elderly community they served. Last week, Sophia had started law school part-time, inspired by witnessing how the legal system could serve justice for vulnerable populations. But the absence Michael left behind remained a constant ache. Eleanor had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that his witnessing Jessica's true nature in court would shock him into recognition, into choosing his mother over his wife's cruelty. Instead, he had disappeared from their lives as completely as if he'd moved to another country. Through mutual friends, Eleanor learned fragments of his story. Jessica's marriage had imploded within months of the trial, her mask of manipulation finally too damaged to maintain. Without Eleanor as a target, Jessica's controlling behavior had focused entirely on Michael, who apparently lacked the tools to recognize or resist her psychological warfare. The divorce had been swift and bitter, with Jessica receiving a substantial settlement and immediately relocating to Atlanta for a fresh start. Michael had attempted to contact Eleanor twice, once through Daniel, asking if she would consider putting the whole thing behind them, and once directly, a stilted voicemail asking if they could meet for coffee. Both times, Eleanor had felt the pull of maternal love, the desperate desire to rebuild their relationship. Both times, she had recognized that Michael's overtures contained no acknowledgement of the harm done, no genuine accountability for his enabling behavior, no recognition that Jessica's treatment had been unacceptable. "Happy birthday, dear," Carmen said, presenting Eleanor with a small potted orchid. Her keen eyes swept the room, immediately cataloging the faces, the tension, the carefully controlled family dynamics she'd observed developing over the past 2 years. During dessert, as Eleanor served the cake she'd made from scratch, Jessica delivered her most cutting observation yet. "This is delicious, Eleanor, though I have to ask, did you remember to set a timer? The edges look a little… well, I'm sure it tastes fine. Baking can be tricky when memory becomes unreliable. Maybe next year we should just order something from a bakery." "Take the pressure off." Eleanor's hands stilled on the cake server. 40 years of successful birthday cakes reduced to evidence of cognitive decline. The cake that had drawn compliments from Michael, Sophia, and Daniel was now suspect, inferior, dangerous. "The cake is perfect, Mom," Sophia said firmly, her paralegal's voice carrying an edge that made Jessica's smile falter slightly. "Oh, absolutely," Jessica recovered quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just worry, you know? Living alone at Eleanor's age, all the responsibilities. Maybe it's time to consider some assistance. There are lovely assisted living communities now. Very social, very safe. You wouldn't have to worry about remembering to turn off the stove or take your medications or whether you've locked the doors properly." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Eleanor set down the cake server with trembling hands, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home," she said, her teacher's voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Of course you are, for now," Jessica's tone dripped with false reassurance. "But wouldn't it be better to make these decisions while you can still participate in the planning? Before you forget something important?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Before you forget something important. As if Eleanor's entire life, her independence, her dignity, were already slipping away into the fog of presumed incompetence. Carmen's sharp intake of breath was audible. Sophia's face had gone pale with anger. Daniel looked stricken, finally seeing the cruelty behind Jessica's concern. Even Michael shifted uncomfortably, though he said nothing. Eleanor looked around the table at her family, her children, her grandchildren, the neighbor who'd become a sister. She saw the discomfort, the avoidance, the careful neutrality that enabled Jessica's behavior to continue unchecked. She saw the future Jessica was painting for her. Irrelevance, institutional care, the slow erasure of everything she'd built over 68 years of living. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, rising from her chair with the dignity that 4 decades of teaching had ingrained in her very bones, "it's time to serve the coffee." She moved toward the kitchen on steady legs, her back straight, her head high. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The birthday celebration that should have honored her life had instead become a preview of its diminishment. Jessica's words echoed in her mind, "Before you forget something important." Eleanor paused at the kitchen doorway, her hand resting on the frame of the home she'd made beautiful through decades of care and attention. She wouldn't forget. She wouldn't forget any of this. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she closed the front door behind the last departing guest. The house felt hollow now, filled with the echoes of forced laughter and the lingering scent of Jessica's expensive perfume. She leaned against the door for a moment, letting the weight of the evening settle into her bones. The birthday cake sat half-eaten on the kitchen counter, its perfect appearance now seeming to mock her. Jessica's words replayed in her mind like a broken record. "Before you forget something important." The phrase had lodged itself deep in her consciousness. A splinter of cruelty wrapped in false concern. She moved through her nightly routine mechanically, covering the leftover food, loading the dishwasher, wiping down counters that didn't need cleaning. But her teacher's mind, the same analytical instrument that had guided her through decades of lesson plans and student evaluations, was working differently now. It was cataloging, organizing, making connections. Eleanor retrieved a composition notebook from the drawer, where she kept her grocery lists and utility bills. Forgiveness, Eleanor told her audience, doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean accepting behavior that was wrong. Real forgiveness requires genuine recognition of harm done and concrete changes to prevent future harm. Anything less is just enabling. After the workshop, Eleanor mingled with attendees who approached with their own stories. Wives whose adult children mocked their hearing aids, grandfathers whose families made jokes about their medication schedules, widows whose relatives had begun making decisions for their own good without consultation. Each story reinforced Eleanor's growing understanding that her experience with Jessica represented a much larger cultural problem: society's systematic devaluation of elderly people disguised as concern and family loyalty. Carmen drove Eleanor home through the familiar suburban streets, their conversation flowing with the easy rhythm of old friendship deepened by shared battle. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Carmen said as they pulled into Eleanor's driveway. "Not that you won the lawsuit, though that was beautiful justice. I'm proud that you found your voice again. You sound like the Eleanor I met 40 years ago when you first moved to the neighborhood. Strong, clear about what you would and wouldn't accept." Eleanor's house welcomed her with the same warmth it had provided for decades, but now it felt like sanctuary rather than just shelter. She'd made changes since the trial, not because Jessica's suggestions about safety had merit, but because Eleanor had reclaimed agency over her environment. A new security system because she chose enhanced peace of mind. Updated kitchen appliances because she enjoyed cooking and wanted better tools. A home office where she developed workshop materials and corresponded with elderly people across the country who had read about her case and found courage in her example. Her evening ritual now included reading letters and emails from strangers who had started their own difficult conversations, set their own boundaries, or simply stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. A woman in Oregon who told her adult son's girlfriend to stop making jokes about her arthritis. A man in Texas who refused to tolerate his daughter-in-law's comments about his accent. Small victories that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Eleanor settled into her favorite chair, Roberto's old recliner that she'd reclaimed after years of letting others dictate which furniture was appropriate for her age, and opened her laptop. Tonight's workshop had generated 3 new requests for speaking engagements and a dozen emails from people seeking resources. The work felt endless and essential, fed by the recognition that elder abuse thrived in silence and shame. Her phone rang, and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. "How did it go tonight, Mom?" "Standing room only," Eleanor replied, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "I think we're going to need a larger venue for next month." "That's incredible. Listen, I got a call today from a documentary filmmaker in California. She wants to include your story in a film about elder rights. Interested?" Eleanor considered the offer. 6 months ago, the idea of national attention would have terrified her. Now it felt like opportunity. A chance to reach even more people who needed to hear that their dignity mattered, that age didn't diminish their right to respect, that keeping peace by accepting abuse wasn't love, it was enabling. "Set up a meeting," she said. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her home and felt something she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death. Complete peace with the choices she'd made. The cost had been higher than she'd hoped. Michael's absence remained a source of grief. But the gains were immeasurable. She had reclaimed herself, found her voice, and discovered a purpose that felt larger than her personal pain. Outside, the Florida evening settled into darkness. But inside Eleanor's house, light filled every room. She had torn down the foundations built on others' comfort and constructed something new, a life based on self-respect, authentic relationships, and the unshakable knowledge that she deserved better than what she had previously accepted. Tomorrow would bring more workshops, more letters from grateful strangers, more opportunities to transform her pain into purpose. Tonight, Eleanor Martinez sat in her own home, surrounded by the dignity she had fought to reclaim, and knew that some victories were worth any price. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote, "The black and white marbled cover reminded her of the countless journals she'd required from her students over the years. Document your thoughts," she'd always told them. "Writing clarifies thinking." She opened to the first page and wrote the date at the top, followed by a simple title: Family Interactions. Jessica. Her penmanship remained steady, the careful cursive she'd perfected in her youth and refined through years of writing comments on student papers. March 15th. Birthday dinner. Present: Michael, Jessica, Sophia, Daniel, Marcus, Isabella, Carmen. She began to write, recording Jessica's comments with the precision she'd once applied to documenting student behavior problems. Each quote, each witness, each context carefully noted. The medication comments, the assisted living suggestion, the criticism of her baking, all of it preserved in black ink on white paper. As she wrote, memories surfaced unbidden, earlier incidents she'd dismissed or rationalized away. The engagement party 2 years ago, when Jessica had jokingly wondered aloud if Eleanor was up to helping with wedding planning. The bridal shower, where Jessica had made pointed comments about traditional ideas being outdated. The wedding itself, where Eleanor had felt more like an obligation than an honored guest. She flipped to a new page and began working backward chronologically, reconstructing a pattern she'd been too hopeful, too polite, too conflict avoidant to see clearly before. December 2022 Christmas dinner. Jessica comments on my old-fashioned cooking methods, suggests I might benefit from meal delivery services. October 2022, Michael's birthday. Jessica questions whether I remembered to RSVP for restaurant reservation, despite having confirmed twice. August 2022, family barbecue. Jessica expresses concern about my driving at night, suggests family should keep an eye on my transportation needs. The pattern emerged with devastating clarity. Each incident viewed in isolation could be explained away as thoughtfulness or generational misunderstanding. But together they formed a deliberate campaign of undermining, a systematic erosion of her credibility and independence. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Sophia. Mom, are you okay? I'm sorry about tonight. We need to talk. Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before responding. I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired. We'll talk soon. But she wasn't fine. Fine would have been enjoying the afterglow of a birthday celebration surrounded by loved ones. Fine would have been feeling cherished and valued. Instead, she felt diminished, questioned, pushed toward irrelevance by someone who should have been family. Another text notification appeared, this one from an unknown number. Her heart sank as she recognized the social media screenshot Sophia had forwarded. Jessica's Instagram post from earlier in the evening, a carefully curated photo of the birthday dinner, Eleanor barely visible at the edge of the frame. The caption read, "Family time. So important to have patience and understanding with our elderly family members. Every day is a gift when you're dealing with the challenges of aging. #blessed, #family, #patience, #senior care." Eleanor read the post 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of insult. The #senior care, as if she were already an invalid. The emphasis on patience, as if tolerating her presence, required saintly forbearance. The clinical distance of referring to her as an elderly family member, rather than Michael's mother or Jessica's mother-in-law. She took a screenshot of Sophia's message and carefully taped it into her notebook, adding the date and time. Evidence. Documentation. The same methodical approach she'd used when dealing with problematic parents or administrators who questioned her teaching methods. The next morning, Eleanor walked across the street to Carmen's house, her notebook tucked under her arm like a shield. Carmen answered the door, still in her robe, her silver hair in curlers, but her nurse's instincts immediately alert. "Eleanor, dear, you look like you haven't slept. Come in, come in." Carmen's kitchen was the inverse of Eleanor's careful order. Newspapers scattered across the table, coffee cups from yesterday still in the sink, pill organizers and reading glasses marking the territory of someone who'd stopped worrying about impressing visitors decades ago. "I need to ask you something," Eleanor said without preamble, settling into the familiar chair where she'd shared countless cups of coffee and conversations over the years. "Last night, when Jessica was talking about my memory, about assisted living, was I overreacting?" Carmen poured coffee without asking, a ritual they'd perfected through years of friendship. Her movements were deliberate, giving herself time to choose her words carefully. "Eleanor Martinez," she said finally, settling across from her friend. "In 40 years of nursing, I learned to recognize emotional abuse in all its forms. What I witnessed last night wasn't concern, it was systematic diminishment." The validation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd hoped Carmen might soften the edges, offer alternative interpretations, help her rationalize away the pain. Instead, Carmen had named it clearly and without equivocation. "She's been doing this for 2 years," Eleanor said quietly, opening her notebook. "I've been documenting the pattern." Carmen examined the pages with professional interest, her expression growing darker with each entry. "This is methodical. Calculated. She's undermining your competence, your independence, your value to the family." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "But why? What have I done to deserve this?" "Nothing," Carmen said firmly. "This isn't about you, Eleanor. This is about her need to control her environment, including her husband's relationships. You represent something she can't manipulate. His history, his foundation, his unconditional love. So she's working to diminish your influence." Eleanor's phone buzzed again. A group text to the family from Jessica. "Hope everyone enjoyed Mom's birthday celebration. I've been researching some wonderful senior living communities in the area. The Palms at Cypress Creek has amazing amenities and a wait list, so it's important to plan ahead. I can arrange tours whenever Eleanor is ready." 2 hearts. The message was accompanied by a link to a luxury assisted living facility's website, complete with photos of smiling elderly residents engaged in craft activities and gentle exercise classes. Eleanor showed the message to Carmen, whose expression shifted from concern to outrage. "She posted that to the family group? She's not even pretending to be subtle anymore." "She thinks I'll forget," Eleanor said, her teacher's voice carrying a new edge of steel. "She said so herself, that I'll forget her insults, forget her suggestions, forget that any of this happened." Carmen leaned back in her chair, studying her friend with the same intensity she'd once applied to assessing patients in crisis. "The question is, Eleanor, what are you going to do about it?" Eleanor closed her notebook and looked out Carmen's kitchen window toward her own house, the home she'd maintained independently for 15 years since her husband's death. The home where she'd raised 3 children, hosted countless family gatherings, built a life of dignity and purpose. "I'm going to remember," she said quietly. "I'm going to remember everything." As she walked back across the street, Eleanor's phone rang. Sophia's name appeared on the screen. "Mom, I saw Jessica's text about the assisted living places. We need to talk. Today." Eleanor paused on her front porch, key in hand, looking at the door she'd painted coral pink last spring, despite Jessica's suggestion that it was too bold for someone your age. "Yes," she said into the phone, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "We do need to talk. And Sophia? Bring your legal expertise. I think I'm going to need it." She hung up and entered her home. Her sanctuary, her fortress, her proof that at 68, she was far from finished with making important decisions. Jessica might believe Eleanor would forget, but she was about to learn that some memories were too important to fade, and some insults too significant to ignore. Eleanor stood in her kitchen preparing Michael's favorite meal, the same arroz con pollo she'd made for his birthday since he was 8 years old. Today marked his and Jessica's 2nd wedding anniversary, and despite everything, Eleanor had insisted on hosting. Family traditions mattered, even when family itself felt fractured. She'd spent the morning simmering the sofrito base, layering flavors with the patience that came from decades of practice. The saffron threads bloomed golden in warm stock, filling her kitchen with the scent of celebration. This was her gift to Michael, not just the meal, but the memory of being unconditionally loved, of having a place where he was always welcome. Sophia arrived first, her paralegal's briefcase replaced by a bottle of wine and a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The past 2 weeks had been tense between them, filled with careful conversations about Jessica's behavior and Eleanor's growing documentation project. "It smells incredible in here, Mom," Sophia said, accepting Eleanor's embrace with the fierce protectiveness that had become her default setting since the birthday dinner. "Your brother always said this was better than any restaurant," Eleanor replied, stirring the rice with wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. "I wanted tonight to be special." Daniel appeared in the doorway, his graphic designer's eye immediately cataloging the careful presentation, the good china, the fresh flowers, the way their mother had transformed her modest dining room into something that belonged in a magazine. "Anniversary dinner worthy of Food Network," he said, kissing Eleanor's cheek. "Though I still say you spoil him." "It's what mothers do," Eleanor said simply, though the words carried new weight now. "Mothers protect. Mothers nurture. Mothers remember when others would prefer to forget." Carmen arrived with a homemade flan, her contribution to the celebration, and her silent support for Eleanor's determination to maintain family traditions despite the growing tension. "That woman better behave herself tonight," Carmen muttered under her breath as she placed the dessert in Eleanor's refrigerator. "I've got my eye on her." Michael and Jessica's arrival was announced by the slam of car doors and Jessica's voice carrying across the evening air. Sharp, irritated, engaged in what sounded like a heated phone conversation about work deadlines and incompetent colleagues. Michael entered first, his architect's precise movements somehow more constrained than usual. His embrace felt apologetic before he'd even spoken. "Sorry we're late, Mom." Jessica had a crisis at the office. Eleanor studied her son's face, noting the stress lines that seemed deeper each month, the way his eyes avoided direct contact. When had he started looking so worn down, so carefully controlled? Jessica swept in behind him, her phone still pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing animatedly as she concluded her call. She looked stunning, as always, her black dress perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite the supposed work crisis. But there was an edge to her energy tonight, a restless irritation that set Eleanor's nerves on alert. "Eleanor. Anniversary dinner. How sweet," Jessica said, ending her call with a sharp tap of her manicured nail. "I hope you didn't go to too much trouble. I know cooking can be overwhelming at your age." The first barb, delivered with surgical precision before she'd even removed her coat. Eleanor felt Sophia stiffen beside her, saw Daniel's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "No trouble at all," Eleanor replied calmly. "I enjoy cooking for family." As they gathered around the dining table, Jessica's commentary began in earnest. The familiar pattern Eleanor had documented so carefully in her notebook, but accelerated tonight, more pointed, less concerned with maintaining plausible deniability. "This is so thoughtful, Eleanor, though I have to say, all this rich food. At your age, shouldn't you be watching your sodium intake? And dairy can be so hard on the digestive system as we get older." Eleanor served the arroz con palo she'd perfected over decades, watching Jessica examine each spoonful as if conducting a food safety inspection. "Oh, and the wine Daniel brought. You're being careful about mixing alcohol with your medications, aren't you? I read an article about seniors and prescription drug interactions. So many tragic accidents happen because people forget what they've taken." The conversation during dinner followed Jessica's lead, dominated by stories from her marketing firm interwoven with increasingly aggressive observations about Eleanor's limitations. Each comment was delivered with that practiced smile, often punctuated by laughter that invited others to join in the gentle mockery of age-related decline. "You know, Eleanor, you're so lucky Michael turned out to be such a successful architect," Jessica said while dissecting her meal with clinical precision. "It must be such a relief knowing he can take care of you when the time comes. And that time is approaching, isn't it? I mean, this house is so much for one person to manage." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to fray. This was Michael's anniversary dinner, a celebration she'd planned to honor their marriage, and Jessica was using it as another opportunity to catalog her inadequacies. "I manage perfectly well," Eleanor said quietly, her teacher's voice carrying a warning that Jessica either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. "Oh, of course you do for now." Jessica's tone dripped with false reassurance. "But let's be realistic. Yesterday you called Michael asking about your television remote. Last week, you mentioned getting confused about your prescription schedule. These little things add up, Eleanor. They're warning signs." Sophia's fork clinked against her plate with unnecessary force. Daniel shifted in his chair, his diplomatic instincts warring with his growing discomfort. Michael studied his wine glass as if it contained the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The breaking point came during Eleanor's story about her and Michael's wedding preparations. She was recounting how she'd helped Jessica choose flowers for the ceremony, a memory she cherished as one of their few bonding moments. "Actually, Eleanor," Jessica interrupted, her voice sharp with wine and frustration, "that's not quite how it happened. You're mixing up the details again. We chose the flowers at Morrison's florist, not pedal pushers. And it was Sophia who came with me, not you. You were supposed to meet us, but you forgot about the appointment." Eleanor felt the familiar twist of confusion and self-doubt that had become Jessica's signature weapon. She remembered the flower selection clearly, remembered admiring Jessica's sophisticated choices, remembered feeling hopeful about their future relationship. But Jessica's confidence was absolute, her correction delivered with the authority of someone who controlled the narrative. "I remember it clearly," Eleanor said carefully. "We spent over an hour looking at arrangements." "Eleanor?" Jessica's smile turned predatory. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This confusion, this mixing up of events. It's getting worse. You probably think you remember helping with the flowers because you wanted to be more involved than you actually were." The room fell silent, except for the gentle tick of Eleanor's mantel clock. Carmen's sharp intake of breath was audible. Sophia had gone pale with anger. Daniel looked stricken, finally seeing the cruelty that had been disguised as concern. But Jessica wasn't finished. And honestly, it's becoming a problem for the whole family. Michael comes home stressed because he's constantly worrying about whether you've remembered to eat, to take your pills, to lock your doors. You call him with the same questions repeatedly. Last month, you told the same story about your neighbor's cat 3 times in one conversation. Michael's face had gone ashen. "Jessica, I don't think—" "No, Michael, someone has to say this." Jessica's voice rose with wine-fueled righteousness. "Your mother is becoming a burden. She's senile, she's pathetic, and she's dragging this whole family down with her delusions of independence." The word senile hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Eleanor felt it hit her chest with physical force, stealing her breath and leaving her momentarily speechless. She forgets conversations, forgets commitments, forgets basic safety precautions. And, the worst part? She'll forget this conversation by tomorrow anyway. She'll forget that we tried to help her, that we offered solutions, that we cared enough to tell her the truth. Jessica leaned forward, her marketing executive's instincts for closing a deal overriding any remnant of social restraint. "Your opinions don't matter anymore, Eleanor, because you can't even remember what you had for breakfast this morning. You're a liability to yourself and everyone around you. The sooner you accept that and let the actual adults make decisions about your future, the better off everyone will be." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at Jessica across the table where she'd served thousands of family meals, in the home she'd maintained independently for 15 years, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with purpose and dignity. Carmen was the first to speak, her nurse's voice cutting through the toxic atmosphere with surgical precision. "That was disgraceful." Sophia's hand moved to her phone, her paralegal's instincts engaging as she began recording, capturing Jessica's cruelty for posterity. Daniel's idealistic worldview cracked audibly. "Jessica, you can't what?" Jessica's mask had slipped completely now, revealing the calculating contempt beneath her carefully constructed concern. "Can't tell the truth? Can't address the elephant in the room that everyone's too polite to mention?" She turned back to Eleanor, her voice carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who believed she'd finally won a long-fought battle. "You want to know the truth, Eleanor? You're already irrelevant. Michael and I make all the real decisions about our life together. Your input is just noise we have to tolerate out of obligation. And soon, even that obligation will end when you're safely tucked away somewhere with people trained to deal with your condition." Eleanor stood slowly, her teacher's dignity intact, despite the devastation surrounding her. She looked around the table at her family, her children, her grandchildren who'd gone silent with shock, her friend who'd witnessed everything. She met Jessica's eyes directly, her voice steady and clear. "I won't forget this," she said quietly. "I won't forget a single word you've said tonight." Jessica's laugh was sharp with wine and triumph. "Yes, you will. That's the beauty of it, Eleanor. By tomorrow, this will just be another confused memory you can't quite piece together." Eleanor continued to hold Jessica's gaze, something shifting in her expression that made Jessica's confident smile falter slightly. "No," Eleanor said, her teacher's voice carrying an authority that filled the room. "I won't forget. And neither will anyone else who was here tonight." She moved toward the kitchen with measured steps, leaving behind the ruins of what should have been a celebration. As she reached the doorway, she turned back one final time. "Thank you, Jessica," she said calmly. "You've just made my decision much easier." The dining room remained frozen in tableau, Jessica's confusion replacing her earlier confidence, Michael's horrified realization of what his wife had revealed, Sophia's phone still recording, Daniel's shattered faith in family harmony, Carmen's witnessing eye taking in every detail. In the kitchen, Eleanor opened her notebook and began to write, documenting every word, every witness, every detail of the moment her daughter-in-law had finally shown her true nature to the entire family. The moment Eleanor Martinez stopped, Eleanor's hands remained steady as she wrote in her notebook, even as the sound of Jessica's voice carried from the dining room. Now defensive, scrambling to explain away what couldn't be explained. The measured tick of her mantel clock provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos she'd left behind, each second marking her transformation from victim to someone who would no longer accept the unacceptable. "Mom?" Sophia's voice was soft, careful as she appeared in the kitchen doorway. Behind her, Eleanor could hear the awkward shuffle of chairs being pushed back, the clatter of dishes being hastily cleared, the retreat of guests who'd witnessed something that couldn't be unseen. "I'm documenting," Eleanor said without looking up, her pen moving across the page with the same precision she'd once used to grade essays. "Date, time, witnesses present, exact quotes. Just like I taught my students, primary source material is always the most powerful evidence." Sophia moved closer, her paralegal's training evident in how she cataloged her mother's methodical approach. "Mom, what Jessica said tonight was unforgivable," Eleanor finished, finally looking up to meet her daughter's eyes. "And legally actionable, if I'm not mistaken." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sophia's face shifted through a series of expressions: shock, understanding, concern, and finally, professional calculation. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress," Sophia said quietly. "Public humiliation, systematic harassment, defamation of character. In front of witnesses, recorded on my phone." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mom, are you thinking about suing Jessica?" Eleanor closed her notebook and looked around her kitchen. The heart of the home she'd built and maintained independently, the space where she'd fed her family for decades, where she'd proven her competence night after night through the simple act of creating sustenance and comfort. "I'm thinking about justice," she said calmly. "I'm thinking about dignity. I'm thinking about what happens to the next elderly person who encounters someone like Jessica if no one ever says, 'Enough.'" From the front of the house came the sound of the door closing, followed by Michael's voice, strained, apologetic, desperate to restore the equilibrium his wife had shattered. "Mom, we need to talk." Eleanor and Sophia exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared understanding. Whatever happened next would change everything. Michael entered the kitchen looking like a man who'd aged years in the span of hours. His architect's precise appearance had crumbled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his face carrying the haunted expression of someone who'd finally seen his wife's true nature. "Mom, I'm so sorry, Jessica didn't mean." "Yes, she did." Eleanor's teacher's voice cut through his excuses with surgical precision. "She meant every word, Michael. The only thing she didn't mean was for everyone to hear it so clearly." Daniel appeared behind his brother, his diplomatic instincts warring with the reality of what he'd witnessed. The family peacemaker who'd spent his life smoothing over conflicts had finally encountered something that couldn't be mediated away. "We can work through this," Daniel said. though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Families have fights. People say things they don't mean when they're stressed or have been drinking. Eleanor studied her youngest son with the same patience she'd once shown struggling students who weren't ready to face difficult truths. Daniel, sweetheart, I need you to listen very carefully. What happened tonight wasn't a fight. It wasn't stress. It wasn't wine. She opened her notebook to the pages of documented incidents. This has been going on for 2 years. Systematic, calculated, designed to undermine my competence and my place in this family. She turned the notebook toward her sons, letting them see the careful documentation, the dates and witnesses, the pattern of abuse their politeness had enabled. Jessica called me senile. She called me pathetic. She said my opinions don't matter and that I'm a burden to the family. She suggested that my input is just noise you have to tolerate out of obligation. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but each word carried the weight of accumulated pain. And she said I would forget it all by tomorrow. Michael sank into a kitchen chair, his hands covering his face. She's been under so much pressure at work, Michael. Sophia's paralegal voice brooked no argument. Work pressure doesn't make someone systematically abuse their husband's mother. What we witnessed tonight was emotional abuse, plain and simple. The silence that followed was broken by Eleanor's phone ringing. Carmen's name appeared on the screen. I'm calling to check on you, dear. Carmen's voice was warm but firm. And to let you know that if you decide to take legal action, you have a witness who will testify to everything she saw and heard tonight. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's unwavering support. Thank you, Carmen. That means more than you know. What legal action? Michael's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. Mom, please don't tell me you're considering suing Jessica. Eleanor looked at her middle child, the boy who'd once built elaborate structures with blocks in this very kitchen, who'd dreamed of designing beautiful buildings that would last forever. Somewhere beneath his panic and denial, that idealistic child still existed. I'm considering protecting myself, she said gently. I'm considering sending a message that elderly people deserve dignity and respect. I'm considering what I would tell my students about standing up to bullies. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Her heart sank as she realized it was likely another of Jessica's social media screenshots forwarded by a concerned family member or neighbor. This time, it was worse. Jessica had posted a Facebook update within an hour of leaving Eleanor's house. Family dynamics can be so challenging when dealing with elderly relatives experiencing cognitive decline. Sometimes the kindest thing is honest conversation about care options, even when it's difficult. Praying for wisdom and patience during this transition. #FamilyCare, #ElderCare, #ToughConversations, #Blessed. Eleanor showed the post to Sophia, whose face darkened with professional outrage. She's claiming cognitive decline publicly, Sophia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She's creating a narrative that you're mentally incompetent. This is defamation, Mom, clear and deliberate. Daniel read over Sophia's shoulder, his diplomatic optimism finally cracking completely. She posted this tonight? After what happened at dinner? She's not backing down, Eleanor said quietly. She's doubling down. Creating a public record that supports her version of events. Michael's phone rang, and Jessica's name appeared on his screen. He stared at it for a long moment before declining the call. She wants me to come home, he said numbly. She's been texting since she left. She says you overreacted, that the family ganged up on her, that she was just trying to help. Eleanor felt a moment of crushing sadness for her son, caught between loyalty to his wife and protection of his mother. But the sadness was tempered by steel, the same strength that had carried her through widowhood, single motherhood, and 40 years of teaching teenagers who thought they could manipulate their way out of consequences. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Eleanor's teacher voice demanded truth. Has Jessica ever made similar comments about me when you're alone together? The pause before his answer told her everything she needed to know. She worries about you, he said carefully. About your safety, your independence. She thinks maybe you should have more support. That's not what I asked. Eleanor's voice remained gentle but implacable. Has she called me names? Has she suggested I'm mentally incompetent? Has she complained about having to tolerate me? Michael's silence stretched long enough to become an answer. Sophia pulled out her laptop, her paralegal training taking over. Mom, if you're serious about this, we need to research your legal options. Florida law on emotional distress claims, defamation statutes, evidence requirements. I am serious, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I've spent 2 years wondering if I was being too sensitive, if I was imagining things, if I was actually becoming the incompetent burden Jessica painted me as. Tonight proved that the problem isn't my perception. It's her behavior. Daniel made one last attempt at mediation. But Mom, if you sue Jessica, it will destroy Michael's marriage. It will split the family permanently. Eleanor looked at her youngest son with infinite compassion. Daniel, Jessica destroyed those things tonight. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen. Her phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, but the voice that answered was professional, authoritative. Mrs. Martinez, this is attorney David Chen. I specialize in elder law and dignity cases. Your neighbor Carmen Santos suggested I call. She thought you might need legal representation. The irony of the surname wasn't lost on Eleanor, another Chen offering to help her fight the first Chen who'd entered her life. But there was something in his voice, a combination of professional competence and personal understanding, that made her pulse quicken with possibility. Mr. Chen, I think I do need representation. How soon can we meet? Tomorrow morning, if you're ready to move forward. Mrs. Santos mentioned that time might be of the essence, given some social media posts that could complicate matters. Eleanor glanced around her kitchen at her children. Sophia determined and supportive. Daniel conflicted but finally seeing clearly. Michael devastated but beginning to understand the choice he'd have to make. Yes, she said into the phone, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent teaching young people about consequences and accountability. I'm ready to move forward. As she hung up, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the satisfaction of taking action instead of absorbing abuse. Jessica had been right about one thing. There would indeed be consequences for tonight's dinner.